This is the 2022 M2 MacBook Air, Apple's latest redesign of their super popular MacBook Air line of laptops. It's got a massive design overhaul and now takes on a design more similar to the MacBook Pros. It is no longer shaped like a doorstop, but now shaped like, well, a notebook. I've had this laptop for weeks now and got to really know it. Is this thing worth considering? Is it a better value than Apple's older M1 MacBook Airs that are still on sale on their site? Well, let's get started with a little review. This video is sponsored by Anker. The brand new iPad Air or iPad Pro you just bought only has a single USB-C port, meaning if you're charging that iPad, you can't plug in anything else. With Anker's new USB-C accessories made specifically for M1 iPads, that will no longer be an issue. The Anker 541 USB-C hub is a compact and powerful hub for M1 iPads. It has an HDMI 2.0 port, USB-C port with power, a USB-A data port, micro and full-size SD card slots, and even a headphone jack, and plugs directly into your M1 iPad Air or M1 iPad Pro, giving you more flexibility to do anything you want with your iPad. The Anker 551 USB-C hub is the ultimate multitasking hub for M1 iPads. It's the first USB-C hub that's also in a foldable stand designed for M1 iPads. The adjustable iPad stands let you angle and elevate your iPad to the perfect position while you work. It has a built-in USB-C port for power delivery, an HDMI 2.0 port, micro and full-size SD card slots, 2 USB-A ports, a headphone jack, and a USB-C port that you can connect directly into your iPad, turning it into basically an elevated mini desktop workstation. And when you no longer need it, you can fold it down into a more compact, easy to carry form factor for storage. If you're looking for hubs or docking stations for your Apple M1 devices, the Anker 541 and Anker 551 USB-C hubs provide performance that meets any user's needs. Check out the link in the video description below. Anyway, back to the video. The M2 MacBook Air body is now in a flatter design and overall feels different than the previous generation MacBook Air. This generation's MacBook Air feels like a slightly fat iPad Pro, while the older one was more rounded and was hiding its chunkiness through deceptive curves. The M2 MacBook Air also comes in 4 different colors now: silver, space gray, Starlight, which is like this lightly yellow tinted silver, and midnight. The one I have here is the $1,200 base model in midnight. Let me tell you, the midnight color is probably the nicest looking color out of all the 4 colors, but it's also a massive fingerprint magnet, and the finish on the midnight model does appear to wear down worse than the other colors. Something I say a lot in my MacBook related content, and something I think applies especially to this midnight colorway, is that people tend to wear things on their wrist, like bracelets, watches, and bangles that can scratch up the edges of their MacBook, which I've seen happen a lot. And so with this color, it can make it really noticeable. So if you want this particular color, just keep that in mind. It might require a bit more babying if you want it to stay looking like when you first purchased it. In terms of I/O, the MacBook Air has a headphone jack, 2 USB 4 and Thunderbolt ports, and a MagSafe 3 port. Any of the 3 ports can be used to charge the laptop with the right cable. The laptop comes standard with a MagSafe 3 charging cable that matches the color of the laptop you purchased. Since this is midnight, the cable is midnight, and it also comes with a 30-watt charger. There is an option at checkout on Apple's website to opt for different chargers with multiple ports or faster charging speeds. But honestly, those are a bad value for your money. And since the MagSafe cable that comes with the MacBook Air is USB-C on one end, I highly recommend checking out reputable third-party chargers that provide the same functionality for less than the price of Apple's upsold chargers when bought separately. They normally provide more ports, more power, and for less money too. The display is now 2560 by 1664 thanks to the new notch, and the speaker grills are no longer on the side of the laptop and are now integrated where the air vents of the machines are. The speakers on the laptop sound pretty good considering the size of this laptop, but you probably shouldn't use this laptop at its highest volume because it can begin to make weird noises due to the speakers rattling in the chassis. Now let's talk about user experience. The laptop is fast in your standard tasks like web browsing, watching videos, answering emails, writing Word documents, whatever. When it comes to video editing, it handled editing the vast majority of my last video, chock full of 4K content, color grading, and multiple layers perfectly fine. No weird stutters or abnormalities. As for gaming, it's not a great gaming experience because there's not that much support for games on M1 Macs, even nearly 2 years into the Apple Silicon architecture. But it plays games decently at low settings when it does support it. This is a fanless laptop, but despite that, this laptop usually doesn't get hot unless you really strain it in prolonged use. use. This laptop is better at bursty loads, meaning it's better for spikes in performance rather than a continuous high-performing machine. And I think most people using this laptop will be using it in that way. They'll need it to render a short video real quick for their photo editing, for running a piece of code, stuff like that, rather than render a feature film to put in theaters or doing heavy 3D graphics or anything like that. By including the MagSafe connector, it frees up the other two ports to be used for other USB-C devices and hubs you wanted to plug in. More ports is always a good thing, though ideally I wish they had the second USB-C port on the right side of the laptop alongside the headphone jack. That way you can plug in a charging cable from either side of the laptop instead of always relying on the left, since you can't always control where the wall outlet is. A downside of the M2 chip is that it still only supports one external monitor beyond the one built into the laptop. You can bypass this with specific dongles that you find on the internet, but really, generally, if you plug in a standard USB-C to HDMI adapter, you'll only be able to plug into one external monitor at a time. This laptop weighs slightly lighter than the previous generation MacBook Air. It's light to the point that I forget that I'm holding a laptop instead of a big iPad. I do want to point out though that Apple utilizes memory swapping on these machines, meaning in situations where you run out of usable RAM, the laptop will switch to using parts of the SSD to make up for it. SSDs are much slower than RAM, but one downgrade this laptop got is a slower SSD than the previous M1 MacBook Air. But in day-to-day usage, you'll most likely never notice. But it is good to point out because as your computer demands potentially grow year after year, this can quickly add up to having negative effects on the M2 MacBook Air's performance for RAM-intensive tasks. The rubber feet on the bottom of the laptop are the same ones from the 14-inch MacBook Pro. But because this laptop is much lighter than the 14-inch MacBook Pro, it's prone to sliding around a lot like it's on a slip and slide. It's not grippy at all. The notch, while noticeable at first if you're not used to it, kind of just fades out of your notice over time, to the point where you don't really think about it anymore. Battery life is still all day, and sometimes that bleeds into the next day. And with 2 straight light days, sometimes you can get a little bit into the 3rd day as well. Okay, so before we talk about the conclusion, I want to talk about alternatives for this M2 MacBook Air. If you're looking at this laptop, you've probably also looked at other Apple MacBooks like the M1 MacBook Air and M1 Pro MacBook Pro. And I'll try to break down why you might or might not want to choose this laptop over those two. The M1 MacBook Air is 90% of what this laptop is. No, seriously, the performance on it is still really good. It's $200 cheaper than the M2, and because it's older, it gets discounted pretty often at different shops for a price of around $750 to $900 USD. And at that price, the M1 MacBook Air, in terms of value per dollar, cannot be beat by any other MacBook. That being said, what this M2 MacBook Air is like the nicer trim level of a standard car. It has an updated design, a MagSafe port, a slightly better display, slightly better webcam, and it's a little faster too. And if those are important to you, then I think you'll like the M2 MacBook Air. But if you're looking for performance, when you configure the M2 MacBook Air with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage, that's when it gets really close to 14-inch MacBook Pro territory. And at that point, the 14-inch MacBook Pro seems like a better value because it has a better display, more powerful chip, more ports, better speakers, multi-monitor support, and because it's been out longer, it has a higher chance to go on sale for a good deal. The only downside to that machine over the M2 MacBook Air is that it's heavier, but that's an easy compromise. I guess this all kind of leads to the conclusion I've been thinking about. Does the M2 MacBook Air make sense for you? Well, the M2 MacBook Air is a pretty interesting machine. If you're a light user whose goal for your laptop is to surf the web, write emails and documents, the M1 MacBook Air will save you money and give you 90% of what the M2 gives you. If you want something that's a little bit nicer, has a newer design, MagSafe 3 support, and a little extra oomph to jumpstart the video editing, photo editing, coding hobby, or whatever skill set you've been working on, then I think that's when the M2 Air starts to make a bit more sense in comparison. But since Apple increased the price of the M2 MacBook Air and kept the M1 Air in the lineup, it makes it a bit difficult to decide between the two. But basically, what I'm trying to say is the M2 MacBook Air is just a nicer version of an already great laptop. And honestly, that's not a bad place to be if that's what you want. It's a good option to consider. Anyway, what do you personally think? Are you considering the M2 MacBook Air? What other laptops have you been considering? I didn't talk about Windows laptops in this, but there are a lot of MacBook Air competitors out there that are getting really, really good. Are you considering those? Leave all that in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and well, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Bye.